All right, so the paper follows two parts. The first is Mariott's, and my own contribution follows that. A year ago, Miriam and I sat and we decided to set up a joint paper as we were both keen to address the ongoing question of how to try to make our teaching relevant for our current students, our own and IMAX ones, while facing numerous changes and transitions in the fields of cinema and media studies, but also facing changes in terms of a generation of students. Our first and preliminary discussion revolved around three main points. The first being what could be the advantages of favoring a collaborative approach, such as group assignments for the students. Number two, how to articulate theory and practice. And number three, how to encourage a research-oriented teaching. While these questions are certainly related to one another, our aim is to be well aware of the various challenges and limitations when we navigate from one teaching framework to another, be it national, cultural, didactical, or pedagogical. Here, we were thinking in particular of the IMAX students who, during their mobilities, are confronted not only with new topics, but also to new didactic tools and expectations. Let me very briefly say why, along this line of thoughts, I am still very committed to a module on fashion at the UVA, a module that, by the way, many IMAX students have taken. So about 13 years ago, I have decided to set up a class that focuses on the close relationship between cinema and fashion. While it is set up for students in the Master's Film Studies, the module is purposely interdisciplinary. Not only is the object of fashion an inherently interdisciplinary one, but also interdisciplinarity enables to examine more critically the numerous intersections between the fields of fashion and cinema. Let me also add that when I suggested a module on this topic at the UFA back then, several colleagues were quite skeptical. Indeed, why teaching about fashion, costume and textiles in a film studies program? This question, as banal and simple as it may seem, is the first one I needed to ask myself, because as we know, beyond any fascination, interest or curiosity we might have about certain topics, the didactic aspects prevail and we have to be able to anticipate the learning impacts of our classes. Not only is fashion a topic that is not inherently akin to academic research, but clothing is often limited to what de facto the actress or actor wear. Moreover, clothes constitutes a necessary attribute to describe and define the film character and their role in the narrative. This being said, I contend that there is much more to see, to conceive, explore, much more to undo, and thus to deconstruct on the topic. In other words, there is more than what meets the eye. After so many years of teaching film from a theoretical, historical and philosophical perspective, I am glad to say that it is probably and precisely through the prism of fashion that I was able to develop and deepen several aspects that I consider to be pivotal for teaching cinema. First, to combine the material and conceptual approach of film through a close look to fashion. Second, the importance of this interdisciplinary research, an aspect that is thus clearly reflected in the choice of readings that I have selected for this module. Third, the importance of collaborating. My class certainly contains a part where students have to write an individual paper, but they also have to work on a common project devoted to the topic of the course, usually in groups of 2 or 3 students, such as an exhibition or a curated film program that is meant to take place in the city of Amsterdam. And here, theory and practice become an indispensable pair. That is, the first weeks they read and discuss several academic texts and analyze all sorts of filmic materials, and then they have to somehow rely on these to come up with original, meaningful, coherent, curated program. Number 4, so fourth aspect, the importance of taking fashion as a global yet culturally specific defined phenomenon. That is, the same way that cinema is a global audiovisual matter, fashion is also an ubiquitous and unavoidable matter on a global scale. Therefore, discussing fashion within the classroom enables students to connect to one another as they are all able to relate it to and bring in their own cultural and personal experiences. For example, last year, having a group with a Dutch, a German, and an Iranian student working together have brought some very unexpected and interesting results. The list of final projects from the students will be probably too long to share with you today in detail, but here are just some examples to get an idea. Every year, I give the students a specific theme or a concept that they are supposed to explore. Sometimes it is a very clear object, such as a tie or a white shirt. Sometimes it comes as a more open or abstract concept, such as movement or the color black. For example, when students had to work with the theme of white shirt, some would take it literally as to come up with a film program of Japanese cinema where the white shirt is a recurrent depicted item. Some other will look at the way that certain contemporary fashion designers have used the medium of film to present their version and collection of the white shirt, while other students would conceive of the white shirt as a metaphor of the cinema screen and will propose a program on early silent film and the idea of cinema within cinema. Another example, when I gave them the theme of black, some students proposed a program on vampire films in the history of cinema through looking at the black cape, while other students proposed a more socio-political understanding of these motifs through focusing on fashion styles in black rap music videos and films. Again, these are just examples, but at the end, what all these projects have in common, didactically wise, is that students realize that setting up a relevant film program requires lots of research that would include readings, but also archival and excavation work, creative and coherent visions of the concepts, and a very clear and solid understanding of what is at stake. When the students present their final project at the very end of the module, I've sometimes invited film festival directors who end up hiring the students, inviting them to present their program during the festivals. I hope you get a sense of how the theme of fashion can open up rather than limit the great creative and conceptual possibilities it may offer. I wish I was sitting with you today to give you more insights on them. But I guess if you want to know more, you can either ask your past students who were enrolled in my classes or read some of my essays on these subjects, because this is research-inspired teaching. Ultimately, I believe that the prism of fashion enables to unfold a multiplicity of interpretation of orientations and configurations for understanding cinema in all its plurality, at once historical, cultural, aesthetical, theoretical, philosophical, and politically. And this helps ultimately to offer different or even alternative views on cinema and the media. The mutual validity of different views on film and media allow me to move from Marie's part of this talk to my own reflection. In particular, I am interested in the way different kinds of knowledge, or perhaps just complex notions, required to be better delivered to our students, in the way these different modes complement each other to the extent of merging. The title you saw in the program, Theory is Thinking, Thinking is Practice, Theory is Practice, is clearly a provocation that hints at these basic ideas. I have two main points that serve as a preliminary assumption to build up my argument. First, the provocation I wish to offer to you for discussion doesn't simply refer to a mode of delivery of our teaching, but it rather is a methodological choice. Second, such a methodological choice is not a deterministic element implemented by the lecturer or the researcher. The method is, so to say, called for by the content of the delivery. That is, the how is determined by the what. I shall return on this because it is a conviction that I share with other colleagues and friends with whom we've been sharing classroom stories. And it is in fact a conviction that comes from experience gained across a variety of contexts and thanks to the continued conversation with colleagues. Coming from an HE system, the Italian one, where applied studies in the humanities are relegated to art academies and very often disregarded as less academic than theoretical education, it comes as no surprise if my experience first as a student and then as a lecturer has been imbued and structured around the frontal delivery of concepts. As much as these have always been illustrated by visuals and complemented by clips, I reckon not much difference was implemented from what I had received myself when sitting in the classroom once I moved on the other side of the desk. Seminar hours, in this sense, have been conducive in raising issues of what is the best way to deliver, say, a lecture in pragmatics of media, or in visual culture, or again in transcultural films, which was the first module that I taught at Coventry University. It is there, in effect, in a different kind of HE system that I had to come to terms, and quite quickly, with a mandate to write a BA course inspired by the motto, putting theory into practice. What had been thus far just an intuition and a desire to look for other ways of approaching some topics soon became something that I really had to pursue in order to attend to my role as course director. But what theory can be put into practice? How to do so? And what do you need to make that happen? In the golden site of hyper-technological facilities, I have to admit I unleashed my old intuitions and ideas and explored across a wide spectrum of assignments and courseworks. Some examples of the courseworks that I wrote into the modules of this course. They range from video letters to digital autoethnographies in the forms of blogs, from the production of a professional self-introduction as a personal website to more elaborate field trips accompanied by reports and interviews that were eventually presented during a student conference. The first two assignments were part of a module I entitled Engaging with Media Configurations. The smart resume, so to say, was written into a module named Planning for Professional Experience, devoted to the professional world, of course, and aimed at preparing the students to look for an internship. While the field trip that I just quickly mentioned was a third year's module entitled Living in the Post-Digital World, which also provided the output we used as a sort of degree show in the form of a student conference at the end of the academic year. This may sound as a great experience which took place in a idyllic context to teach film and media, except that it is double-binded to a HE sector that heavily relies on awfully high fees, which for sure ensure students to benefit from cutting-edge technology, from last generation facilities and so forth, but also leads to a non-sustainable financial scenario in the long run. So without really wanting to fall in the easy temptation of condemning the neoliberal university, I cannot help taking the opportunity to at least question its ethical validity and at least highlight the connection between such a system and the content of our lectures. Do we really need to provide a hyper-performative light laptop from a renowned American company with a full Adobe suite ready to go to each and every one of our students? It is that which allows us to be creative in our posts, to engage them in what we do, to get them thinking. Probably the question doesn't even pose in the majority of our current institution. It doesn't pose in the institution where I am working at now. But at the time I faced this situation, and it was very useful to me to answer no, it doesn't. It is important, it may help, but it is not essential. What is essential is, as I just quickly mentioned, to get the students thinking. So here is my key point for you. I had to come up with creative, practical assignments for my students, but the ultimate aim of this was to prepare them to land ashore better equipped to explore the unknown territory of theory. In a way, this reminds me of Ludwig Wittgenstein's take on philosophy. Philosophy, which of course is often regarded as the least practical and exquisitely more theoretical of disciplines, whilst to him, to the philosopher, this was nothing but a Tätigkeit, that is, an activity. In his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, he notably stated that, quote, "the object of philosophy is the logical clarification of thoughts. It is not a theory, but an activity. A philosophical work consists essentially of elucidations," end of quote. A rather explanatory application of this idea applied to our field of study is to be found in media archaeology. And in fact, it was first Siegfried Zielinski in the mid-90s and more recently van der Strauven who explicitly borrowed Wittgenstein's concept of Tätigkeit. According to the former, Wittgenstein adhered to the premise that philosophy is not something to be set out on a professional chair, but should be a continuous action of clarification in its very own medium, which is the language. Similarly then, media archaeology should be a continuous action of excavation into the history of potential, sometimes alternative developments of the media. The emphasis here falls more on the process of excavation itself that enables the eventual rethinking rather than on the result of the digging. And this is a feature shared by van der Strauven's perspective on the topic, which comes out quite clearly, especially in a recent work on Italian designer and pedagogist Bruno Munari. Picking up from Munari's Labs for Children and his interest in the process rather than the outcome, Vanda has documented her own teaching activity, that is the labs informed on the Munari's model, which she delivered in a number of different universities. Most of them, I think, they are part of the IMAX network, such as University of Udine and Goethe University in Frankfurt. So the lab is the concept where Strauven proposes a connection to the notion of Tätigkeit. Specifically, she thinks of the lab, and I quote, as a historical method adopted to rethink history, to rethink its linearity, its temporality, and its potentiality, end of quote. Put it differently, the lab is the concept, and yet a very concrete concept. It is a site where, according to Strauven, it is possible to observe the shift from the what to the how. By looking at some old and new ways of doing media archaeology. In this area, in this discipline, this creative thinking typically takes the shape of circuit bending workshops or DIY practices employing obsolescent technologies and apparatus used to activate processes of hardware hacking. Whilst unfortunately not all HE institutions own such collections and do not necessarily have the appropriate spaces to organize such workshops, the most recent experience I can bring to exemplify the lab attitude I am discussing is the Lab AFA, Arte, Fotografia, Audiovisivi, that we initiated at Ca Foscari University of Venice 2 years ago. And this lab is the first lab activity introduced in the master's program, History of the Arts and Conservation of the Artistic Heritage, where the IMAX pathway is included. In fact, I do remember very clearly having Paris 3 and Nanterre students attending this lab. So this lab is an interdisciplinary module focusing on visual arts, photography, and audiovisual media. To attend to this interdisciplinary nature, we decided it to be co-taught by colleagues with different specialisms, so contemporary art, photography, film, and media. The main idea around which the project revolves was to find a way to provide our students with methodological skills across a wide spectrum of areas, such as the production of a photographic and audiovisual project, the curatorship and setup design of a photographic and audiovisual exhibition, the acquisition and loan of art pieces, the dissemination, cataloging and conservation, promotion and selling strategies, and so on and so forth. Structure-wise, the Lab AFA comprises both a series of guest lectures and some work group sessions guided by us lecturers and a tutor. As for the guest lectures, these are delivered by professionals working in the most important art institutions in Venice, and they aim at providing a close account around art making, conservation, cataloguing, promotion and circulation processes, addressing key issues that are explained by using very often case studies to illustrate practical processes encountered by the professionals in their day-to-day experience. As for the group sessions instead, here students are divided into groups, and all these groups work towards a unitary project, and yet each group takes care of one specific aspect of it. For example, there is a group dealing with research and putting together the concept of the project, another group dealing with output production, another with communication and promotion, and so on and so forth. Last year, thanks to the collaboration with Bevilacqua La Masa Foundation in Venice, the students had the opportunity to conduct archival research at the foundation and delve into overlooked artist Guido Sartorelli's work. This was really a brilliant opportunity because Bevilacqua La Masa just acquired some works and the personal archive of the artist, and this material is yet to be archived and organized. So it was a brilliant opportunity for the students to learn that as well. They were asked to come up with creative ideas to interpret Sartorelli's artistic endeavor, and they had great ideas. They had the idea to create an impossible interview with the artists where they enacted a sort of play, recruiting a classmate to play Sartorelli, and some of them played the journalist roles. And the interview will eventually be turned into a podcast that will be aired on Ca Foscari radio. Also, the more substantial research has led to an interpretation of one of Sartorelli's favorite formats when it came to his own publications, which is the postcards. So the student decided to produce postcards synthesizing the artist's poetics and systematizing the interesting materials they found in the archive. And I had taken with me the example, so the outcome of this. So these are the postcards that the students produced with a nice introduction explaining what the work was about, and then some images from the Sartorelli's archive with some patterns that he was really fond of, and okay, and these are organized with like a small description, credits, the title and the names of the students that work on this, and a QR code to potentially go more in depth into the content. So it was a very simple and yet very effective production, engaging directly with one of the formats used by the artists. So in our intention, this lab would elicit collective thinking, and would do so by way of hands-on experience, and this would help with a set of module outcomes directed to develop critical thinking processes. All in all, thinking and making, philosophy and the arts, theory and practice may provocatively correspond one another, insofar they are equally forms of critical reflection. They may both produce disruptive practices, and most importantly, they mutually fit one another. Just as the spectator of a film or a visitor of an exhibition is not simply called to passively consume a media artifact, and instead can engage with the thinking process of the director or of the artist, so the philosopher and we as lecturers in the same position, given that we are also supposed to think as the first task, is not simply absorbing concepts, but rather reviewing them so as to open up new ways of seeing reality. I imagine this kind of process as an indistinguishable mix of intellectual labor and first-hand experience. I also see it as an imaginary encounter between John Berger, who notably authored a book with the same title, Ways of Seeing, 1972, and Nicholas Mirzoeff, whose book How to See the World, much more recent, 2015, addresses precisely the challenges arising the moment we try to engage within the world, by way of images, diagrams, and films. An aspect of both books that I find significant is the inherent attention that the two authors reserve to self-criticism, as if looking for a host of different ways of seeing the world not only implicates us, but it does so forcing us to acknowledge the ethical dimension along with the process, as well as the political dimension attached to it. So teaching cinema works the same way to me. And I hope that today's conference and IMAX on the whole reminds us of our ethical and political roles that we have the privilege of having in front of our students, and that, I hope will be discussed at the end of this session. So that is it for me. Apologies again not to be there in person and for the probably very bad quality of this video, which has been recorded in a hotel room at Frankfurt Airport. Next time will be in person. So see you there. Bye.